This video will show you how I began to analyze the data of my young students when I was watching how they became mathematicians. So the first thing I did was spread out all the data that I had collected so far. What was data? Things that were interesting to me. This piece right here that Zach had done, I found extremely interesting because he didn't show how he had solved that problem, and that started a big, huge study. I thought, if Zach doesn't show his work like this, how do other students in my classroom solve problems? Because I didn't teach any kind of traditional algorithm. So this one piece of data from Zach became something very, very important. I started to look at how my students solved algorithms. So I wanted to know how the rest of my students solved these problems, so I needed more data. So I had them do some problems, I interviewed them, and I did lots and lots of observations of them solving problems. So I triangulated my data. I took interviews, I collected work samples, and I did lots of observations. When I first analyzed my journal, I noticed that I wrote a lot of, I don't understand, or I have no idea, or I couldn't follow. So I noticed these patterns emerging in my journal. But I went to the work samples to learn more. Since my students weren't being taught traditional algorithms, I needed to know what they were doing to solve these raw problems. Katie used her fingers. Ross showed me how much he knew about place value. He started with the tens, he went left to right. Jacob also started left and showed me that he knew place value by writing a 40 and a 70 instead of a 4 and a 7. Christopher showed he knew place value as well, starting in the hundreds column. He also went left to right. Kyle always added quickly, but I was always confused by why he did things the way he did things. He always added up to make it easier for him to add quickly. He also added left to right. So what did the work samples teach me? They taught me a lot of things. All of my students start from the left. They all start from the tens, or hundreds. They knew what place value was. They knew what tens meant. They could explain their thinking in writing or verbally with each other and to me. And everybody solved these problems differently. Here's an interview with Caitlin I did. I asked her to explain to me how she solved 3-digit addition problem, and she went and got a piece of paper and showed me. She said it was too hard to explain without using paper. In an interview, when I asked Kyle the same question, he got a piece of paper and drew a picture of his brain and what goes on inside of it. And Megan was just very matter of fact. I just know that these are the tens, you know, the 10 spot. So I start here, then I go from there, and that's all I do. So what did I learn? Well, from my interviews, work samples, and journal, I really learned that I needed to investigate place value. I mean, seriously, where were they getting all this information? So I decided to do more focused observations. So I did more interviews, collected more work samples, continued to journal specifically about place value. And I created this simple chart so that I could keep track of when I noticed when my students were using place value. And I wrote about it in my journal. And I remember being so shocked about it because we had been doing calendar for a long time, but I just didn't realize what an impact that intense amount of time that we were taking in the morning was having on my students. So I decided to interview them again. It was because of those interviews and the data I had collected from their work samples and my observations that led me to really expand more on that calendar. So that even though I started out looking at math journals, I became interested in really focusing in on one specific piece, calendar, because I was looking at the data and what my students were telling me. And I wrote about calendar and told that story. And here's a little peek into the story of what I learned about calendar.
Next page. -1 times 31 plus 62.
I started doing calendar back in my Math Their Way days. I learned the basic daily routine from doing that. Many of the ideas have come from the Opening Eyes materials and from my own ideas by watching the kids. I think I began doing calendar like many new teachers who do certain activities, because everyone did it. I have realized just how much kids learn about math and mathematical thinking in this intense 30-minute block of time. I try to pack as many concepts as I can over the year into calendar. For example, calendar is where my students really internalize the concept of place value. During the how many days have we been in school part, they are moving sticks from boxes labeled ones, tens, and hundreds. There are no limits at calendar. Even the youngest children who don't participate in each activity are getting exposed to all the concepts, and exposure is the key.